6 Marines are lying in elephant grass on a ridgeline 20 miles from the nearest friendly unit, and the only thing between them and an NVA regiment moving through the valley below is the fact that nobody knows they are there. That was the job. That was Force Recon in Vietnam, and for the men who did it, being invisible was the only thing keeping them alive. The 1st Force Reconnaissance Company was the first unit in the entire Department of Defense organized and trained to conduct deep reconnaissance behind enemy lines. Activated in June 1957, these Marines traced their lineage back to the Amphibious Reconnaissance Battalion of World War II, a unit so secretive that its presidential unit citation had to be classified. By the time the 1st Marines waded ashore at Da Nang in March 1965, 1st Force Recon had already been in country for weeks. Captain David Whittingham led 1st Platoon, Sub-Unit 1, on preliminary reconnaissance of the amphibious beach landing sites in February 1965. They slipped in, mapped the beaches, and slipped out before the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade ever hit the sand. That is about as Force Recon as it gets. Now pause on that for a moment. Before the infantry landed, before the press arrived, before the first shots were fired on camera, Force Recon Marines were already there, swimming the approaches, sketching the terrain, reporting what they found directly to the commanding general of 3rd MAF. No battalion staff, filtering the information. No regimental headquarters, deciding what mattered. Straight to the top. That was the difference between Force Recon and everybody else. Division Recon reported to Division. Force Recon reported to the theater commander. And in 1st Corps, that meant Lieutenant General Lewis Walt. The problem General Walt faced in 1965 was one nobody in the American military had trained for. In the Pacific and in Korea, you could find the enemy because the enemy held ground. You could photograph his fortifications, count his bunkers, estimate his strength. In Vietnam, the enemy held nothing except the jungle he was walking through. He dispersed during the day and concentrated at night. He avoided contact unless he had local superiority, and when he did fight, he vanished before a reaction force could arrive. So how do you find an enemy who does not want to be found? Walt's answer was Force Recon. On the evening of June 13, 1966, UH-34 helicopters dropped Staff Sergeant Jimmy Howard and 17 Marines and Corpsmen from Charlie Company, 1st Reconnaissance Battalion, onto the top of Hill 488 in the Key Hole Valley, about 25 miles west of Chu Lai. Howard was a 16-year veteran, a former drill instructor, a Korean War Silver Star recipient who had held 30 yards of perimeter by himself on a place called Bunker Hill. His team's mission was simple: sit on top of this barren knob, watch the valley below, and call in artillery on anything that moved. The hill the Marines called Nui Vu was barely 75 feet across at its widest point, shaped like a lopsided 3-bladed propeller. Almost no cover except a boulder about the size of a Volkswagen, with the top chopped off. Beyond the hill lay nothing friendly, all the way to Laos. For 2 days it worked perfectly. Howard's team spotted NVA and VC formations moving through the valley, with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, torches blazing at night, columns marching in broad daylight. The Recon Marines called in fire missions from ARVN 105 batteries and watched the rounds land. Secondary explosions from stored munitions confirmed they were hitting something important. But there was a cost to all that success. Every fire mission told the enemy someone was watching, and it did not take long to figure out where from. On the afternoon of June 15th, word reached Chu Lai that a full NVA battalion was moving on Hill 488. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Sullivan, commanding 1st Recon Battalion, radioed Howard with the intelligence. Howard requested immediate extraction. Several UH-34s launched from Chu Lai, but they came under heavy machine gun fire before they could reach the hilltop and were forced to turn back. Sullivan relayed the news that no extraction was possible until daylight. Consider what that meant. 18 men on a bare hilltop with nowhere to hide, and a battalion of 300 to 500 NVA regulars climbing toward them in the dark. The odds were somewhere around 25 to 1. At 10 o'clock that night, Lance Corporal Ricardo Binns fired the first shots from his M14. That was the only warning they got. The NVA swarmed the hill from every direction, Dushka machine guns, and 60mm mortars hammering the crest while infantry pushed up through the grass. Howard pulled his men back from their outposts to a tight perimeter around the big rock. The enemy responded with a shower of hand grenades and a short assault that the Marines threw back. Then they shifted tactics, probing quietly in the dark, feeling for a weak point and getting killed every time they found one. Near midnight, Howard radioed Captain Tim Geragti, asking for extraction and close air support. The request went up to 3rd Math's Direct Air Support Center. It took time. Too much time. The Marines were already bleeding. What happened over the next several hours on that hilltop belongs in a category of fighting that most people cannot imagine. Howard took an AK round in the back that paralyzed his legs. He dragged himself from position to position on his elbows, whispering encouragement, using bins to relay commands while he continued calling in fire missions. Holmes moved from wounded man to wounded man under fire so intense he later said the enemy was within 20 feet. Grenades detonated constantly. The NVA launched coordinated assaults. The Marines beat them back with semi-automatic fire. Every shot aimed, every round counted, because they were running out of ammunition. The C-47 arrived around 1 in the morning and began dropping flares, which gave the Marines enough light to see targets, but also silhouetted them for the enemy. F-105 Says, F-8 Crusaders, and Marine helicopter gunships began making runs, but the NVA was so close to the perimeter that calling in ordnance was almost suicidal. And here is a detail that most people miss. When the ammunition ran critically low, Howard ordered his men to stop using automatic fire entirely, semi-auto only, and when the grenades ran out, they started throwing rocks. Rocks! The idea was that in the dark, the enemy might mistake them for grenades and take cover long enough for the Marines to stay alive, another few minutes. That is not a tactic you find in any field manual. That is raw survival instinct from men who refused to quit. By dawn, 6 of the 18 Americans were dead. Every single survivor was wounded. Some had been wounded multiple times. When Company C, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines fought their way up the hill that morning, losing 2 of their own in the process, they found Howard's Marines armed with AK-47s stripped from enemy dead. 8 rounds of their own ammunition remained among the 12 survivors. 43 NVA bodies lay within 5 to 20 yards of the perimeter. Some had died in hand-to-hand combat. The decorations tell the story. 1 Medal of Honor for Staff Sergeant Jimmy Howard. 4 Navy Crosses, 13 Silver Stars, 18 Purple Hearts. Reader's Digest reported it was the most decorated unit for its size in 193 years of American military history at that time. But Hill 488, as extraordinary as it was a 1st Recon Battalion action. The Force Recon story in Vietnam runs deeper and in many ways quieter than a single legendary stand. What made Force Recon different was not the dramatic last stands, it was the patrols that nobody ever heard about. The ones that went out, found the enemy, brought back intelligence that saved lives, and came home without firing a shot. That was the mission. That was the standard. 2 distinct mission types defined Force Recon operations in Vietnam. Keyhole patrols, also called green operations, were pure reconnaissance. 4 to 8 Marines inserted by helicopter into remote jungle, lightly armed, carrying cameras, scopes, and 2 PRC-25 radios. Their job was to observe, identify, and report. If they were seen, the mission was compromised. If they fired a weapon, the mission had failed. Avoid contact at all costs. Move like ghosts. Report what you find. Stingray patrols were the other side of the coin. Direct action. 7 to 10 Marines, heavily armed, inserted into areas of known enemy activity with pre-plotted artillery and air support. Their job was to find the enemy and destroy him without ever going head-to-head. Spot a column moving down a trail, call in a fire mission, watch the rounds land, adjust, and call in another. If the enemy broke and ran, let the arty chase them. If they charged your position, you had claymores, tear gas, and an extraction bird inbound. The genius of Stingray was that it turned Force Recon's greatest limitation into its greatest weapon. A 6-man team cannot fight a regiment, but a 6-man team can find a regiment, And if it has a radio and a forward observer who knows his job, it can rain down more destruction than a battalion of infantry. The kill ratios were staggering. A study conducted during the war found that for every Force Recon Marine killed in action, 34 enemy were killed. That was 4 times higher than conventional infantry units. And 95% of the time Force Recon teams made contact, they initiated it. They chose when to fight, where to fight, and how to fight. The enemy rarely got that choice. Let those numbers settle for a second. The birth of Stingray traces back to the summer of 1966 and Operation Hastings. The NVA had pushed a major force south out of the DMZ, and Marine rifle companies met them with heavy firepower and stopped them cold. An estimated 800 North Vietnamese were killed, but the survivors were slipping away into the jungle, and somebody had to find them. Team Criminis, under Sergeant Orest Bishko, was sent out as a 4-man patrol with a specific mandate. Find the retreating NVA and destroy them using indirect fire. Accompanying the team was Bing West, a Marine infantry officer serving as a tactical analyst, ordered to observe the concept and report on its feasibility. The patrol inserted by Huey in the early morning. They found a good observation point, spotted NVA movement, and Corporal Thomas Moran called in artillery. The rounds hit. More enemy appeared. More fire missions. When NVA was spotted following the team's back trail that afternoon, Moran called in another barrage that destroyed the trailing force. The next morning, the team linked up with their extraction helicopter, having executed the most successful indirect fire engagement of the war to that point. West's report went up the chain and was well received. The Stingray program was born. From then on, Force Recon teams would haunt the North Vietnamese. They operated from Da Nang, Phu Bai, Chu Lai, Gia Vuc, and Cam Duc, all within the 1st Corps Tactical Zone. Their area of operations ran from the coast to the Laotian border through some of the most unforgiving terrain in Southeast Asia. Triple canopy jungle, razor-backed ridgelines, river valleys that flooded without warning, and everywhere the NVA. The 3rd Force Reconnaissance Company was activated in September 1965, specifically to meet the demands of Vietnam. Formed at Camp Lejeune and built around a cadre from 2nd Force Reconnaissance. The company drew volunteers from across the Marine Corps. They trained in the Caribbean and Panama before deploying to Vietnam in May 1966. Upon arrival, they assumed responsibility for Quang Tri Province, patrolling north of Highway 9 to the DMZ. That put them in some of the most contested ground in the entire war, operating along the approaches to Khe Sanh and the mounting corridors the NVA used to infiltrate south. And this is where the story of a single team shows what Force Recon was really about. First Lieutenant Andrew Finlayson led Team Killer Kane out of 1st Force Recon Company. Finlayson was the kind of officer who earned respect the old-fashioned way, by leading from the front and learning from every patrol. The death of Sergeant Barnes and Corporal Blankenship to a booby trap on March 25, 1967, hit the team hard. Barnes was on his last mission, a patrol he did not have to be on. After talking it over with his men, Finlayson made a decision. From that point forward, Team Killer Kane would go out as hunters, not just gatherers. On their next patrol, Finlayson convinced the helicopter pilots to drop the team north of the planned landing zone, into the area where Barnes and Blankenship had been killed. They set up along a trail and waited. 2 Viet Cong walked into the ambush and died. A second ambush killed 2 more and produced a dispatch case containing the names of communist undercover agents operating in Antenna Valley. Intelligence gold. Finlayson called for extraction, knowing when to push and when to pull back. That restraint mattered as much as the aggression. Over the next 9 months, Team Killer Kane conducted 34 long-range reconnaissance patrols. The numbers are almost hard to believe. 181 confirmed enemy killed. 254 probable kills from artillery and airstrikes. 42 confirmed kills by small arms. 9 enemy soldiers captured. Caches of documents, supplies, and materials seized. On May 15, 1967, the team was sitting on an observation post on Hill 203, overlooking the Hip Duc Trail, when they spotted 7 Viet Cong walking below them. Finlayson sprang the ambush with small arms and M79 grenades. 1 confirmed dead, 4 probable. Not long afterward, the team spotted an estimated 100 VC coming down the same trail. 100, against a handful of Marines. Finlayson immediately called in an artillery mission. As the enemy scattered from the barrage, he reached a spotter plane that called in airstrikes of napalm and rockets. More than 30 enemy confirmed killed. What strikes you about that engagement is the calm. There is no panic in a Force Recon contact report. There is identification, fire mission, adjustment, assessment. The training took over, because the training had to take over. You cannot hesitate when you are 6 men watching 100 enemy soldiers walk toward you. On July 21, 1967, Team Killer Kane's most devastating action came in A Shau Valley, also known as Happy Valley. The team was conducting a reconnaissance patrol on the second day of their mission, when the point man heard voices in a nearby ravine. They were loud, careless. Finlayson initially thought he had bumped into friendly Marines, but after checking his map, confirmed no friendlies were in his box. The enemy felt so safe they had abandoned basic security procedures. Finlayson set up a 4-man ambush, his machine gunner, point man, backup, and himself. At his signal, they opened fire. The surprise was total. 10 minutes of sustained fire, in which only 2 short bursts of erratic return fire came back, then hand grenades and gas grenades into the ravine. Finlayson led his men down to search the contact site. That is, Force Recon reduced to its purest form. A handful of Marines turning the enemy's own complacency into a killing ground. By 1969, the war was changing. Vietnamization was accelerating. American units were drawing down, and somebody still had to keep eyes on the NVA to prevent surprise attacks on withdrawing forces. That dangerous assignment fell to Major Alex Lee and the 3rd Force Reconnaissance Company when he assumed command in late 1969. Lee was a career infantryman with combat experience and a background in reconnaissance technology from the Landing Force Development Center at Quantico, where he had helped develop the beacons, laser designators, and sensor equipment that would define modern recon operations. Under Lee, 3rd Force Recon became the tip of the spear for Lieutenant General Herman Nickerson's 3rd MAF. The company operated in the far north of 1st Corps, into and beyond the DMZ, running patrols into the A Shau Valley, which was as close to NVA-owned territory as existed in South Vietnam. The valley was a major infiltration corridor, thick with enemy base camps, supply depots, and troop concentrations. Every insertion was a gamble. Lee's small teams were flown in by helicopter, knowing that the NVA had anti-aircraft positions covering the likely landing zones, knowing that if they were compromised on insertion, the odds of survival dropped sharply. What Lee brought to the job was a combination of tactical innovation and bureaucratic warfare. He handpicked his staff, scrounged equipment through trades and favors when the supply chain failed him, fought his own administrative command for the resources his Marines needed, and refused to carry out operational directives from Washington that he believed would get his men killed. He deployed ground sensors, starlight scopes, and radio relay stations on mountaintops to maintain communications with teams operating far beyond normal range. A relay team on the rock pile kept contact with patrols deep in the A Shau, rotating Marines through on a weekly basis. The missions themselves were brutal in their simplicity. Insert a team, track NVA movements, recover downed air crews, conduct bomb damage assessments after B-52 strikes, report everything. Get out alive. Some teams went in and came out clean, their reports feeding the intelligence picture that kept larger units from being ambushed. Others walked into hornets' nests and had to fight their way to an extraction zone under fire, calling in Cobra gunships and fixed-wing air support to suppress enemy positions long enough for a helicopter to come in. The nature of that work wore on men in ways that conventional infantry never experienced. A grunt in a rifle company had his platoon around him. He had firepower, numbers, support. A Force Recon Marine had 5 or 6 teammates and a radio. If the radio went down, he had nothing. If the extraction bird could not get in, he had to survive until it could. The psychological weight of operating that far behind enemy lines, knowing that discovery meant death, created a kind of stress that did not end when the patrol ended. You came back to base, debriefed, cleaned your gear, and knew you were going back out in 48 hours. And yet the volunteers kept coming. That is the part of this story that deserves more attention than it usually gets. Nobody was forced into force recon. Every man in those companies volunteered, passed a brutal selection process, and chose to go back out again and again. Some of them, like Sergeant Major Maurice Jacques, served 3 tours in Vietnam, with First Force Recon beginning in 1965. Others, like James Capers, a staff sergeant who led a team called Team Broad-Minded, conducted more than 50 classified missions, including a prisoner rescue attempt ordered by President Johnson himself. Capers was likely the first black Marine featured prominently on a Marine Corps recruiting poster, and possibly the first to receive a battlefield commission in Vietnam. The corpsmen who served with Force Recon deserve their own chapter in this story. Navy Hospital Corpsman Bruce Norton, known as Doc, was assigned to both 3rd Force and 1st Force Recon between 1968 and 1970, participating in more than 30 long-range patrols. He was the only Navy corpsman ever designated as a Force Recon team leader. Both jump and scuba qualified, decorated for heroism under fire on multiple occasions. The bond between a recon team and its corpsman was absolute. If you went down, Doc was coming for you. That was not a hope, that was a fact. In February 1968, when the Tet Offensive erupted across South Vietnam, Force Recon's value was proven in the most painful way possible. First Force Recon had been reporting increased enemy activity and massing around Hue for weeks before the attack. The intelligence was there, the warnings were there, and they were not acted upon with the urgency they deserved. When the NVA and VC stormed the city, First Force Recon continued patrolling the hills surrounding Hue, conducting 35 patrols through the month of February alone, calling in over 120 fire missions or airstrikes on enemy targets. Out of 180 Marines in the company, 34 were wounded and 4 killed. That is not a statistic you read in most accounts of the Battle of Hue, but it should be. The intelligence they gathered, the fire missions they directed, the enemy formations they identified and destroyed before those formations could reinforce the fight inside the city, all of that shaped the battle in ways that never made the evening news. Force Recon did not hold a street corner in Hue. They did not plant a flag on the citadel. They operated in the shadows around the city, doing the work that made it possible for the infantry to take those street corners and plant those flags. And when the fighting was over, they went back into the jungle for the next patrol. The 3rd Force Recon Company was deactivated in mid-1970 as American forces withdrew. The 1st Force Recon Company had departed South Vietnam in August 1970. Between them, they had compiled a record that set the standard for deep reconnaissance operations that endures to this day. The 3rd Force Recon Company was one of only 2 Marine units during the entire Vietnam War to receive the United States Army's Valorous Unit citation. The men who served in those companies came home to a country that did not want to hear what they had done. Most of them said nothing. Force Recon Marines were not the type to talk about it at the bar. The operational security that kept them alive in the jungle carried over into civilian life as a kind of permanent silence. 50 years later, many of them still maintained what one veteran described as calculated, silent professionalism. Their motto was 3 Latin words: Selen, Silent, Mortalis. Swift, silent, deadly. No phrase in military history has ever been more literally earned.